Hello and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm Nick.
And I'm Alistair.
And this fortnight, we'll be talking about Inside Man, a new crime miniseries from Stephen Moffat from the BBC, and then we'll be talking about After Yang, a thoughtful sci-fi film written, directed and edited by Kogonada. But before both those things, Alistair, what else have you consumed in the last fortnight?
Well, for a change, I'm coming to recommend a graphic novel, which is an unusual switch around.
Holy shit.
Recently, I finished reading Pyongyang, A Journey in North Korea. This is by Canadian author Guy Delisle. People who've been with us for a long time will remember way back in the old recommendation section, I recommended one of his other graphic novels to Nick, which was Jerusalem Chronicles from the Holy City. The sort of format of the graphic novels that Guy Delisle does is they're all sort of autobiographical stories of his travels to various unusual places around the world. In Jerusalem, his wife is working for MSF and he's just living there looking after their children. In this one, it follows the time he spent working for a French animation studio in North Korea, where they get their cartoons animated. And it just follows his life and what it's like to sort of live and work in the most secretive, isolated country in the world. The whole thing is set around a series of short, scenes or sketches, I suppose, like of just small things. Like some of them are just like how difficult it is to find somewhere to go for a drink on Friday night because there's only 3 hotel bars in the whole city that let foreigners in, or his various attempts to ditch the sort of translator and sort of escort he's provided with the whole time, or the sort of various museums he's taken to and how they manipulate Korean history. Yeah, it's just full of the sort of small details of everyday life. It's a sort of, an insight into what is must be a very bizarre place to live and quite terrifying at times.
Yeah, I think I may have read this several years ago. It sounds vaguely familiar to me. And yeah, I've definitely read at least one of Guy Delisle's books, obviously Jerusalem. I do remember these being quite, enjoyable, relatable travelogue material in that Guy Delisle has a good sort of sense of his own outsiderness and, does a good job of both bringing through his own feelings but also not just making it entirely self-centered and about him. Yeah.
He's good at sort of the observational travel writing, I suppose, which sort of works when he travels to these unusual places. And, it's very much the outsider perspective looking in, which is, I think, more so the case in North Korea, because in Jerusalem, obviously he meets lots of people who are very willing to talk about their view on, local politics and history. And he does make a real effort to kind of meet Israelis and Palestinians and people from the various other ethnic and religious groups living in Jerusalem. Whereas in this, because you're so controlled, everywhere you go is pretty much dictated by your guide, and the regime is obviously so strict that it's really impossible to get a kind of a perspective on what the everyday people of Pyongyang think. He can only really say what he sees and what he interacts with. Almost everyone he talks to works for the regime, or is connected to the regime in some way, and just talks about how brilliant it is and how they're the happiest, most prosperous country in the world. And I think at some points he even muses like, do these people really believe it, or do they believe it, but does the every person in the street believe it? It's almost impossible to tell to what degree the propaganda from the regime has actually penetrated into people's minds, but it's impossible to get that insight because no one really talks to him, apart from the other NGO people.
Yeah, I remember it coming across like he was walking out this really strange, quiet place where no one seems to want to talk to him, and he was under constant supervision. And wasn't there loads of wasn't there like a massive wheel or big wheel or something that had just been built and then abandoned or something, and it was just deserted?
Yeah, there's lots of strange things like that. Yeah, there's like huge construction projects that started and not finished. Yeah, I think there's some kind of Ferris wheel type thing at some point that's just been abandoned. And there's strange, like he goes to this like enormous sports center that's just basically empty to be showed a taekwondo demonstration, but he gets there and there are no students, and there's just this kind of big empty building just covered in pictures of Kim Jong-il and Kim Il-sung. Yeah, you really get the sense that this is a very, very strange place, the degree to which it's sort of locked down, and how also like isolating it is.
Yeah, it was very captivating, just the sheer oddness of it, because I read Jerusalem as well, and that read a bit more like I'd expect a travel book to be, but he goes to another city and sees the landmarks and talks to the people, and the Pyongyang one was just really strange.
Yeah, I think Jerusalem is a good one to start with. I think that's because it's more of a straightforward travel log. He travels around, he meets people, he talks to them, he gets different perspectives, he visits places. You don't get the sort of normal travel writing experience, I suppose, from going to North Korea, because everything you do is just so mediated by your guides and things like that. There are bits where he meets people who work for other NGOs and organizations, like the handful of outsiders living in Pyongyang, and some of them have been there longer and understand it more, and you get kind of their perspectives on things they've seen or things they've done, which broadens it out a bit. But then again, they're still outsiders. They're still not, Koreans, so it's kind of still impossible to say how much people actually believe what they're told. But there is all sorts of like crazy things about how strict and authoritarian their life is, like how everyone must wear a tiny pin of Kim Il-sung or Kim Jong-il. Yeah, like there's a bit when every office pretty much has a wall that has a picture of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il on it. This is before Kim Jong-il died in the book, so there's no Kim Jong-un in the picture. But yeah, there's this, every office must have like a wall with their picture on it, and at one point he tries to put up like another picture on that wall, and they're told like, no pictures on the wall apart from the picture of the two dear leaders. And yeah, it's just something almost like weirdly like, yeah, somewhere between Orwell's 1984 and the kind of religious cult, the sort of state that the party and state has achieved power, which is, yeah, sort of terrifying in itself.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's one of these things which is very separate from our life, I guess. I mean, is Dalil Canadian?
Yeah, he's Canadian, and I think he's from Quebec, so he's like a native French speaker, although I guess Quebecois is, I think, quite different to French as spoken by the French. I think they sort of diverge at some point. But yeah, I think he's native Quebecois speaker, but also speaks English, obviously. And in this, he's working for a French animation company who are, yeah, having all their cartoons drawn in North Korea. So yeah, I assume he speaks French well enough to work for a French company. Yeah, I think it's partly he's had an interesting life travelling around. I think the fact that his wife works for MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders in English. So yeah, she travels around a lot. I guess, yeah, they speak French well enough that she can work for a major French NGO. Most of the others, like in Jerusalem, the story is basically him being a full-time dad and doing some comic writing, and while his wife kind of works in the NGO sector, as well as the Jerusalem one. I think there's one in Myanmar. That's the sort of more usual setup. It's interesting, this one is him solo travelling.
I never got round to going back and reading many of the others. I don't know how many others there are other than Jerusalem and Pyongyang, but I was very impressed with the two I read. He's clearly a very good storyteller. It would probably be a good thing to do to check out some of his other work.
Yeah, I've heard that the Burma Chronicles would be an interesting one. So that might be a good one to go to next. But yeah, if you're looking for something a bit different in your graphic novels, I can recommend this. If you're interested in North Korea at all, it's a really interesting read. And yeah, if you kind of like travel writing and graphic novels and want the two interests merged into a single text, then Pyongyang is the book for you, because it's kind of one of the few that actually does that, yeah. Cool. So I've been mentally travelling to North Korea. Nick, what have you been up to?
Well, I've been returning to more of a warm, safe, comfortable space. I've been watching the second season of Only Murders in the Building, the murder podcast comedy show on, well, Hulu in America, Disney Plus in Britain, starring Steve Martin, Martin Short, and Selena Gomez as three people who live in a luxurious high-rise in Manhattan and end up starting a podcast to investigate, well, murders, but only murders in the building. Because for some reason there seems to be a lot of murders in this building. Yeah, it's a sort of silly comedy about murder, basically. Every season out of the two, a murder happens at the beginning, and then these three idiots solve it and make a comedy true life podcast about it. Well, it's very serious to them. Yeah, at this point, they've got this sort of weird fan base who hang around the building. The police all hate them because they're literally making a podcast about this murder as it happens. But they are persisting in trying to solve this murder alongside a web of their own family angst and personal drama that's coming alongside this. And yeah, the first season of this was a big, I guess, breakout hits last year, to an extent that something that stars multiple really, really, really famous people and is made by Disney can be a breakout hit. And second season, I guess just through the laws of not being a new thing, hasn't made quite as much of a splash, I don't think. But no, it's still good, reliable fun. The chemistry between the three leads is pretty much the main appeal here. I must admit, due to not being down with cinematic legends, I have not seen much / possibly any of the work of Steve Martin or Martin Short, but they are incredibly funny guys. This is very good shit. They do have a very good sort of natural bantery back and forth charm going on, and Selena Gomez is keeping up with them nicely. It's a good show.
Yeah, this has caused quite a splash. I've not been watching it, but my partner really loves it, and it's just interesting to see that the true crime podcast has got to the point where now it's sort of been spoofed in comedy TV. It's definitely achieved that level of cultural cachet. I mean, I guess like Serial and stuff is some of the most popular things in the world.
Yeah, I enjoyed the way that in this season, especially, they've reached a point where the fact that the podcast also has multiple seasons is being used as a way to sort of snippily comment about the TV show itself. Like, they can say things in dialogue like, you know, it feels like the plot is moving on a lot slower than it did last season. That sort of thing.
Oh, so self-aware.
Yeah. So yeah, I enjoy that. It's cheap meta comedy, but makes me laugh.
Yeah. Oh, I can see he's also one of the writers. Steve Martin is also one of the writers of Only Murders in the Building.
Yeah, it's kind of very much a showcase for the three main actors, and part of the gimmick, I guess, is that there are a lot of quite famous people drifting in and out of this building. It's one of those sort of American shows which is set in America and just happens to have a combination of famous people playing side characters and famous people who are occasionally playing themselves. There was a weird recurring joke in season 1 with Sting living in the building.
Oh dear.
And one of the characters having a series of really strange, awkward interactions with Sting. And this year, Sting has moved out and Amy Schumer has moved into his flat. And a different one of the characters has a really strange, awkward, occasionally creepily flirty relationship with Amy Schumer. It's very odd.
Right, okay. Fair enough, yeah, that seems like lots of potential for comedy there. It's an amazing cast, I must say. Like, Steve Martin, I guess, is like, certainly for a while, is like one of the guys in like American comedy. You know, he was big on Saturday Night Live. I think he was like, I don't know how far Saturday Night Live goes back, but like, I think he might have been the original cohort of like really famous comedians to break out of Saturday Night Live. For everything from like Father of the Bride, Roxanne, you know, The Jerk, Planes, Trains and Automobiles. I mean, the guy's got like a real catalogue of legendary comic performances. Not so much recently, I will say, looking down his career sort of, I don't know, faded a bit in the last decade or so.
Until he made the show.
Until he's made the show. I hesitate to say comeback because he has been steadily working and, you know, it might be the sort of stuff that's popular, but I don't really watch it, or like just popular in America. But, you know, this has really achieved mainstream success, and it goes to show that, yeah, he's back at, you know, the forefront of American comedy.
Yeah, no, as I say, I don't claim to have any familiarity with his past work. I can't confidently state I've never seen a Steve Martin film, but I certainly don't remember seeing a Steve Martin film. And, yeah, he's great in this. He and Martin Shorts both have a good sort of natural, different comic personas that play off each other. He's chosen to play this sort of slightly grumpy hermit guy, and Martin Short is this constantly attention-seeking extrovert, and they just prickle each other and annoy each other in grumpy old men style, and it works quite well. And Selena Gomez just sort of affectionately rolls her eyes at them. Probably not the most original dynamic in comedy history, but it works.
I was about to say, that really sounds like a sort of screwball comedy duo from sort of the 60s or something like that. So,
it probably is a bit. I think it is definitely channeling that. You know, it's in this sort of this grand old New York building. It's definitely channeling a lot of sort of retro energy, even though it can claim to be modern just because it's got podcasts in it.
Yeah, everything from the apartment through to trying to think of other famous screwball comedies now. Good knowledge there. Good knowledge.
I mean, you're the film guy, Alistair. You're on your own here.
I should have just said The Apartment. I dug myself a hole by saying The Apartment and then couldn't think of a second one.
Well, Alistair's cinephile card has just been set on fire, but never mind.
Yeah, but it doesn't seem like they're channeling something that's very well established in Hollywood, but not sort of so popular anymore. Bringing it back and making it modern by throwing in like true crime podcasts, which is pretty up to date.
Well, yeah, they're definitely channeling something retro, but it doesn't feel like a nostalgia trip. It doesn't feel like... I mean, there may well be in-jokes throwing back to other stuff in the genre or other stuff that Steve Martin or Martin Short have worked on, but I don't get them, and it's still funny. So
yeah, and Selena Gomez, I believe, was briefly the most followed person on Twitter. You know, that was an accolade she had at one point. Yeah, so they're, again, a very modern personality. I consider anyone younger than me to be very modern. But,
yeah, again, not someone whose prior work I have any acquaintance with, but she's very good in this. She has her own sort of emotional arc that she's going on, and she's got some troubled past shit going on, which she plays well. I mean, they all get the occasional bit of somewhat serious dramatic material, but she probably gets the most somewhat serious dramatic material, and she does a good job of it.
Oh, great, yeah. So you'd recommend this show, and you say it consistently maintains the quality?
I mean, I've got like one episode left to watch, so hopefully I should have seen it by the time this airs, so no one can spoil me. But yeah, unless they completely soil the bed in the final episode, yeah, it's keeping it up. I don't know if it's quite as straightly iconic as the first season, but no, it's still very good fun. The cast are still there with the same chemistry, and that's worth watching by itself, to be honest. So yeah, good show. Controversially, yes. I liked this popular show.
Next up this episode, we will be discussing Inside Man, a new BBC drama series created by Stephen Moffat and starring David Tennant and Stanley Tucci. Jefferson Grief, played by Stanley Tucci, is on death row awaiting execution for killing his wife. Whilst he's there, he solves mysteries. At the same time, Harry Watling, played by David Tennant, his normal life as a vicar is thrown into chaos when his son's maths tutor accuses him of being a paedophile. We've seen this 4-part drama series from the BBC. Nick, What did you think of it?
Yeah, I quite enjoyed this in a sort of trashy way. It's not great. It may only just be cusping on the edge of good, but it is entertaining. There's quips, there's a few key good characters played by good big actors. There's a mostly fairly well-controlled plot of people making bad decisions and sinking lower and lower. I mean, you do have to kind of ignore a few key, slightly silly plot jumps. But yeah, you know what? I quite enjoyed this. I was reluctant to say I quite enjoyed this till I'd seen the final episode and confirmed that Stephen Moffat didn't just throw in some random shit, which just broke the whole story. But no, he managed it. It stayed within its bounds. It resolved itself without completely breaking its own rules too much. So yeah, it's fun. If you're, aggressively burnt on Moffat, then yes, there are some Moffatian ticks in here you may well find annoying, but as someone who still has some tolerance left for the man, I quite enjoyed this.
Yeah, that's pretty much spot on. I wouldn't say it's great, and I wouldn't say it's terrible, which kind of sounds like I'm saying this is a sort of average drama, and the weird thing about the show is it's not average. It kind of swings mercilessly from being a quite intense, sometimes quite viscerally unpleasant thriller to then swinging to be like utterly daft and just completely unbelievable. It just sort of really lurches all over the shop. It's definitely not average. It's, just sort of swings violently around. Yeah, it's got this interesting dynamic of these sort of two plot lines that converge. Yeah, one with this sort of basically evil Sherlock Holmes who's in prison solving mysteries. I guess the classic setup for almost any drama series. Insert person, they solve mysteries.
Yeah, well, what if Sherlock Holmes was also Hannibal Lecter, yeah?
Yeah, pretty much, is what we've got here. Yeah, David Tennant doing the classic normal, really nice guy pushed to the edge, doing the sort of classic falling down type bit.
David Tennant is doing a lot in this show, like his personal charisma and his sort of likeable guy persona that he has, and the way it sort of gets unpicked by these absolutely ridiculous circumstances he finds himself in through a series of really bad coincidences. He's doing a lot to sell his actual serious angst over this. This is a very good performance by David Tennant, which probably does a lot to make what is a very silly storyline actually work.
Yeah, I absolutely think it's the cast that kind of makes this. Yeah, David Tennant, obviously, we've seen him do nice, lovable, sort of quirky father figure in The Doctor, and obviously, playing a very creepy villain in Jessica Jones. The guy's got range, and, he's got acting chops. He's been in the Royal Shakespeare Company. He can certainly act, and he is acting the heart out of this character. Stanley Tucci, I thought, very good, much more understated, quiet performance. I really struggle to think how this character would have worked if they didn't have Stanley Tucci or someone of that caliber. I believe Stanley Tucci took the part because he was locked down in Britain. He's married to a British woman. I think it's Emily Blunt's sister he's married to. Anyway, he was locked down in Britain during COVID, and the filming was close enough to his house that he could safely go there and not risk COVID exposure. So I think it's a bit of a coup that they managed to get him, and I don't really see this working if they got someone else.
It's a very COVID-y production in some ways. Like, a lot of it takes place in, like, 2 or 3 sets with, like, the same, like, 2 pods of casts that very occasionally slightly intermingle for, like, a couple of scenes in the very last episode.
Yeah, and a lot of people shouting across rooms at each other.
Yeah, so I can see how this is a bit of a COVIDian production, but Moffat has clearly written around that reasonably skillfully. It more or less works on that level. And Stanley Tucci, he's playing this with a bit of a raised eyebrow, a bit of a sense of self-aware camp, whereas David Tennant is throwing himself into it a bit more.
Yeah.
But, I don't know, it's so silly. Tucci's character specifically is such a ridiculous Sherlock genius, you kind of have to, I think, play it a bit like that. And I think Tennant's taking it so seriously does compensate for that.
Yeah. They work well together, and I do think the casting is what does make this work to the extent that it works.
I mean, on a personal note, this sort of slightly silly tone versus slightly grim subject matter that you mentioned is very much my personal bag. If you're one of the 5 or 6 people who read my Hobson Shaw novels, which I wrote a few years ago, they're not a million miles away from this. They're not quite as complicated as involved, but the jokes versus murder level is very much there.
Yeah, I mean, the Hobson and Shaw is actually quite a good analogy, I guess. But the thing when I was reading Hobson and Shaw is that that this is done firmly with tongue in cheek. And, the comedy is supposed to be there. Whereas I do sometimes wonder about, were they aiming for this to be quite so daft? Or is it just inadvertently kind of silly?
There's quite a lot of bantery dialogue, often at quite odd times. So you have to assume Moffat is aware of the silliness of it to some degree.
Yeah, how the plot twist on top of plot twist get sort of ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, there is also a sort of sense of melodrama, especially towards the end when David Tennant is making some quite, genuinely grim decisions. There's quite a lot of just him sitting alone in a room, staring into space, looking tormented by the weight of the world, which he, again, is selling just through sheer acting force.
Yeah, I suppose it's up to you whether you feel the tone works or not. It kind of skirts around believability. I mean, it's going to be difficult to discuss this without getting into the plot, because this is quite a plot-heavy show.
Okay, so yeah, there'll probably now be some spoilers for Inside Man. We may endeavour not to completely ruin the ending, but if you want to go into Inside Man completely pure, then, cover your ears and run. It's all on iPlayer now. I think it's going to be on Netflix in the nearish future if you're in America. And yeah, for what it's worth, if you enjoy very involved, silly dark comedies and or Stephen Moffat scripts, yeah, it's probably worth watching.
Certainly interesting. It's worth, exploring the plot, which is there's a series of escalating misunderstandings that lead to dark and terrible places. It's kind of one of those sort of plot lines in that David Tennant, who is a vicar, beloved by his community, Mr. Nice Guy and all that, with his wife and his son. He's given a flash drive to look after by his verger, who is a troubled man trying to, turn it all around. And he's given it to hide, which he hides without question. And then the maths tutor finds it and discovered that it has child pornography on it. Thinking that it's regular pornography, for his son claims it's his, I guess to save his father embarrassment. And then his maths tutor becomes completely convinced that his son is a paedophile, or that he's a paedophile and that his son's covering for him being the vicar, David Tennant. And she tries to go to the police, and then David Tennant, through a series of escalating attempts to stop her doing that, locks her in his basement and ultimately handcuffs her to a pipe. Describing it like that makes it sound completely daft and utterly unbelievable. And weirdly, it does sort of work how it escalates from simple misunderstanding to a sort of believable series of things spiraling out of control. I mean, sometimes when shows or writers attempt to do this sort of thing, you just think, look, there's a point when people would say, okay, can we all just calm down for a minute and talk this through? And then someone would go like, oh, I see the misunderstanding I've made. And yeah, they address that. There's various bits when David Tennant tries to explain what's going on, but he doesn't want to shop to the police. His verger, who's a troubled man, has attempted suicide. He's trying to protect him. He's trying to look after everyone. He's trying to be a really good guy and just protect everyone and protect his family. And yeah, it skates believability, but it somehow managed to stay on the kind of, yeah, I believe this probably could happen, or at least suspend my disbelief enough for a TV drama, rather than just throwing my remote down and going like, this is just stupid.
Yeah, David Tennant's sort of emotional journey as this guy who clearly has, as he keeps saying, he's a fucking vicar. He's got a very strong self-image as this sort of nice guy who's just doing nice things for the right reason. And it just gets to the point where he's doing increasingly horrible things whilst explaining with increasing anger how morally justified he is. He is, I guess, very much meant to epitomise what has been known as the nice guy with capital letters on the internet in the last 20 years or so.
Yeah, he believes he's a good and righteous and just person, and therefore it's not his fault anything that he does, because it's just, he's always trying to do the right thing, but the world or whatever is pushing him to do terrible things like lock someone in the basement. And it's a good capture of how the kind of every day can sort of spiral out of control, and what would you do if you were pushed so far to protect your family. One of the slightly strange things about this show, though, especially in the early episodes, first and second, is that I kind of felt that the characters, everyone stayed, considering the stakes, relatively calm and acted with bizarre levels of rationality, like very, very cold, rational behavior, almost like they're playing chess. At every point, people make decisions that seem basically to be incredibly rational, despite the fact there are extreme circumstances they're in, like the way they try to manipulate each other. Like the woman in the basement almost says like, well, as a way to get one over on them, like, I could help you with my murder. I understand that, it's almost like a kind of locked room puzzle, or one of those things when like the characters all try to anticipate the flaws of each other's plans and outmaneuver them. There's a sort of psychological duel going on, but I did feel that like these people are almost unnaturally rational. It's almost weirdly like a sort of economist view of the world, is the only way I can put it, where people only act in their rational self-interest and are not guided by emotion at all, which just seemed very strange.
Well, then again, what David Tennant's doing a lot of the time is guided by emotion, because if he was just guided by rational self-interest, he would have turned in the fucking verger at the beginning of the plot.
I guess so. Yeah, and like you say, David Tennant does bring a touch of emotion to this, which makes it more believable and things like that. And as it goes along, you can see the kind of emotional tenor does rise, especially in the last episodes. You get much more of people breaking down, people being upset and angry, which is one of the reasons why it sort of works.
And it actually takes place over quite a short span of time. I guess it maybe seems longer just because we're used to TV taking place over a longer span, and plus, we watched it over 2 weeks or whatever.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's like about 30 hours in this show.
Yeah, I just felt that like there's this, certainly early on there seems to be a kind of clinical level people making strategic decisions, even though David Tennant's guided by powerful emotions like his love for his son, his love for his family, his self-belief in himself as a good person. Early on, certainly below the surface, and he kind of is sort of quite cold and rational in how he acts and how he talks. And that, I felt, stayed on the far side of believable. There are many examples of shows that do the whole normal people pushed into crazy situations where things spiral out of control, and something like Shallow Grave or Mad Dogs, I felt, really captures it better, the sense of the rising emotional stakes, the fact that as people dig themselves in deeper, they make more emotional decisions and have less control of themselves and their circumstances. Whereas I just felt this didn't really nail that. It just sounded a bit too much like characters who are aware they're in a murder mystery and trying to outthink it.
It is very clinical in some ways. It is very people being moved around, as you say, like bits on a board game board. Like there's lots of like clear establishing of where things are and what people are in what places with what items. And it's in some ways, it's quite cleverly done. Moffat has clearly put a lot of thought into this.
Yeah.
But some of the leaps are a bit massive. There's a reveal in the final episode that, for various plot reasons, one of the tangential characters just happens to be some sort of criminal godfather with access to a private army, which, alright, that is the closest he does to breaking it for me, and he just about doesn't, but that was ridiculous. Yeah, but he's clearly put a lot of thought into this, and that thought is very heavily on display, and the emotion is also there, but I don't think it's as prominent.
It's partly because he wants to do this story of ordinary person pushed into extraordinary circumstances out of their control, and whenever you see these things, you think there's this moment when a character should just say, stop this ride, I want to get off it. And that would that's what a normal person would do. And that obviously, when you get to that point, it totally deflates the tension because it makes it seem really artificial what's going on. Now, Moffat is aware of that obstacle and is determined to skirt around it by making it so that at no point, as soon as things start to spiral out of control, one character can just level with the other and find a sort of sensible way out of this. So he's skirted that obstacle. But the way he's done it is by people thinking ahead probably much more than they would. This bit is going to get possibly a little bit graphic, but like when the maths tutor's locked in the basement, like for the first time, one of the first things she says she does is she cuts herself to leave blood and around the basement and like pisses in around the basement. You don't see this, but she's told that she does it so that she's leaving, DNA evidence, so that if they do decide to kill her, there'll definitely be something left of her there, which is a sensible thing to do to elevate your power in a situation, and David Tennant doesn't just kill her. But I really don't think anyone who'd just been locked in a basement by someone who was their friend would think like, okay, so what's the rational thing to do here? Oh yeah, make sure there's evidence that I've been here. They would probably just sob for a few hours.
Yeah, I mean, I think the character was meant to be being established as being quite cut off and quite self-reliant and intelligent. To try and counter that. Like, there's a whole flashback sequence at the beginning of episode 4 about, the maths teacher and the son's relationship, which I thought was quite good on that. Although it does come weirdly late in the show.
Yeah, a good bit of context. Like I say, there was at no point when I was basically said, like, this is beyond the bounds of credibility. Like, you've lost me. I felt it kept me the whole way. But like a sort of rickety fairground ride, there were moments when I was thinking, like, this thing is making some unusual clunking noises. Am I about to be thrown off horribly? And I made it, that's a weird metaphor, I know. And I made it to the end, but I guess other people might have collapsed at some point along the way.
Yeah, no, I have seen some people on Twitter saying, look, this is just fucking stupid. And I cannot argue, but on some level, this is fucking stupid.
Although, if you're interested in TV, I would recommend anyone watch this to see if you can make it to the end without being like, I think this is too stupid. Because I made it to the end with moments like, I was definitely on the knife edge at some point, but I think it successfully landed it with basically being like, yeah, that worked. That's take it to the bank,
It has a certain trashiness which appeals to me. It's not taking itself seriously enough for me to think that the fact that some of it is a bit stupid is a killer criticism.
Yeah, and I think about one iota more of seriousness, again, would have ruined it. I don't know if they've lucked out with something that perfectly balances believable, unbelievable, ridiculous, and dark drama, or if they've just kind of lucked into this space.
Moffat's been doing this a long time. I guess we'll perhaps have to assume that he vaguely knows what he's doing.
Yeah, no, that's a valid point. Very valid point. But yeah, again, it's worth putting yourself through this to decide where your level of believability lies. And it certainly, as someone who likes to think intellectually about TV, it really is a one to thinking like about, does this work? Does this not work? It's certainly, if you're a writer, worth watching, because there's lessons to be learned here.
Yeah, and it's hard not to see the Stanley Tucci side of the story as a pitch for a future series or a future second volume or whatever, because there's definitely parts of this that are not resolved.
Yeah, and I definitely was thinking, if they make this a recurring show, the David Tennant character is clearly the one season arc, and the Stanley Tucci would be the returning character. I mean, obviously, yeah, he's a man in prison, he solves mysteries. He can have another mystery brought to him. And because he's locked in a cell at one time, I guess he can probably film that in America and still be in it if he enjoyed this so much that he wants to keep playing the character.
Well, yeah, exactly. It would be that hard to make this more of a procedural thing. And as I say, there are some various hints dropped about his wife's murder and why he did it and how he did it and stuff, which are not resolved in this. So I assume Moffat's got half an eye on a possible future.
Yeah, and there's a sort of post-credits coda, I guess, setting up the second series, which was, again, slightly strange. Skirts the edge of believability.
It was a bit silly, but as a vague, silly teaser, I'll take it. I doubt we'll get another season of this for another few years, so he's got plenty of time to work out what the hell he was talking about.
Yeah, and there's no point us telling what it is, because it would just ruin the whole thing.
Yes, but for the record, if you watch this, there is a post-credits coda. If you enjoy the silliness in the show, you'll definitely enjoy the silliness in the post-credits coda.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. It's it's one of those things that is sort of beyond belief that this got made, because it's really singular. I think it works. It's borderline, but it works.
It's convoluted in a way that is fun. You know, on the Moffat scale, and we have admirably resisted banging on too much about other Moffat works for most of this review. But on the Moffat scale, yes, it's convoluted and silly in a fun way, as opposed to in the style of some of his later worse work on especially Sherlock.
Yes, exactly.
There's very much an edge you can tip over there. The next series may well be complete bollocks, but this one was quite fun.
Yeah, this worked. I just realised I didn't have a point to make there, so obviously just cut it with your
yeah,
point.
Sure.
Unless you've got more to say.
No, I'm fine. You want me to leave this in, or?
No, it's good. Finally, this episode we will be discussing After Yang, a new film starring Colin Farrell, Jodie Turner-Smith, and Justin H. Min. In a future where android family members, called techno-humans, are readily available, Jake and Kara have purchased Yang, an older brother for their adopted daughter, Mika, to connect with her Chinese heritage. However, when Yang breaks down and cannot be repaired, the whole family grieves his loss. We saw this film recently. What did you think of it, Nick?
Yeah, this was a really lovely film. Very odd, sort of sad film. It's the sort of story which I've often said in the past starts to seem redundant in the face of Black Mirror just monopolising this kind of material. But this particular version has such a strong take on it and a strong singular point outside of just the what if phones but too much or whatever Black Mirror cynicism that, yeah, it manages to still seem good and relevant through sheer force of quality. Because, yeah, it's not so much about, you know, what is the technology doing to us, but more about, I guess, how we relate to it and how the human emotion reacts to this sort of robot expiring, this sort of sense that this robot has stopped working and I don't know, the people around it sort of want to treat it like it's just an appliance breaking down, but they're struggling to admit that it's also basically the death of a family member, and it's just this sort of long, sad bit about that kind of grief. There's a bit of stuff about the sci-fi as well. In all honesty, there's a lot of interesting background world building here, which I almost wanted to see more of, but possibly if this film had been more about the world building, that would have pushed it into Black Mirror territory. So yeah, very nice film. Very nice sort of quiet sci-fi film. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's very sad, which I liked. Yeah, it's about how humans will pat bonds with non-human things, even though, yeah, Yang is a full part of the family, even though he's a machine on some level, but it doesn't mean they don't have as rich relations to him as you would have to anyone else. Yeah, it's quite an arty film, which I quite liked. There's sort of lots of shots of like trees and various sort of slightly abstract bits that are thrown in, and there's a lot of long shots and sort of quiet bits, but I really felt the artiness of this did work really well, because a substantial amount of the film is Jake, the Colin Farrell character, exploring Yang's memories. He finds a chip when he takes Yang to be repaired in him, which has his sort of things that Yang himself has chosen to commit to sort of long-term storage. And he's kind of exploring these, and the fact that the film is quite arty, quite abstract, kind of conveys the nature of memory, I think, very well, and the nature of kind of emotional memory, in that it's not linear, it's not straightforward. You know, memories are sort of snatched moments, you know, sometimes just a memory is just like a tree or people just sitting around not really doing much, but that's something that you do remember. And the slight, yeah, I think it's a good exploration of memory and how memory and remembering someone is like a part of grief, and that kind of really works with the sort of tone and style of the film.
Yeah, like a lot of it seems to be set around a few sort of, there's these key interactions that each character has with Yang, which they sort of remember, which in all cases aren't really these big, pivotal, emotional, melodramatic moments. There's not that much weeping and crying, but there's this sort of just these soft moments where they start to see Yang as a person rather than a machine, and it's very subtly done. And yeah, the more surreal sort of art or arty bits where they're exploring his memories as well. It's a very soft film. It sort of washes over you as this sort of, it's just sort of creating this sense, the feeling, if you will.
Yeah, it's a mood piece.
Yes.
I think it really works. Although it's sort of consistently sad throughout, I kind of didn't want it to vary the tone, really, even though, it's like, it's quite a sad film, but you almost don't want it to not be sad and things like that. There are a few sort of like moments of levity in it. There's a great early scene when there's this sort of opening bit with the family before Yang breaks down, when they're engaged in this virtual family dancing competition, which is just sort of like hilarious, the sort of weird virtual dance things that families get up to in the future, which plays over the opening credits, which also, and I've rewatched it since seeing the film, it's setting up all the characters that in the film as they're all in the family dance-off.
Yeah, I did notice that I vaguely recognised a couple of the actors in the family dance-off at the beginning, so I assumed they'd be back, and it was a sort of intro to all the characters.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Well, the phrase in cinema in cinema theory is called contrapuntal, which is when something is like very, very the opposite of what's going on. An obvious example is in Reservoir Dogs, when there's Mr. Blonde is like slicing the cop's ear off, but it's done to that Stuck in the Middle of You song, which obviously does not match the tone of the scene, but it's done deliberately. Anyway, the family dance-off is done in the same way. It's contrapuntal, which means that it sticks out. It's tonally different from the rest of the show, and is a sort of tonally different, and it provides a moment of levity amongst a sad film, but it still kind of keeps that slightly strange, abstract approach that the film has.
Yeah, I liked the intro actually as a whole. The sort of, they don't really linger on setting up what's going on. To be honest, because I did not know what the film was about before I went to see it, because I'm a purist for the experience, I did not entirely realise that Yang was going to be a robot, so I didn't fully get it until the point where he was like deactivated and they were talking about getting him repaired. And yeah, I liked the way that the early 2 or 3 scenes to sort of gently set that up before just jumped straight to the point where he was deactivated. There's a very sort of efficient deployment of the sci-fi there. This really doesn't waste its time getting bogged down in exposition, it just is. And it keeps that up throughout, I think, in terms of how it deals with its conceits and its setup.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the sci-fi is sort of just woven into the tapestry of the world. And yeah, as you said before, there isn't a lot of world building. But you do get a sense of the world that they're in. That this is certainly quite a bit of time has elapsed. In the sort of cityscapes that you can see, there's new buildings. There's a lot of green everywhere. There's a lot of plants and things. But sometimes it's almost like deliberately not exploring the world, in that there's a lot of scenes of people traveling places in what you kind of assume is a car, but it's never really revealed. You're clearly in some kind of module traveling through some kind of tunnel various characters are in, and it's not public transport. They're there together and they can kind of make phone calls to other characters, but you don't really get a sense, are they driving? Is this an automated vehicle? Is it on rails? There's some kind of future transit system, but it's almost deliberately not shown to you. The focus is kept very strongly on the characters and what they're doing and what they're experiencing in that moment. Which, I kind of liked that sense that almost like the world was kept back from you a bit. But then again, if you were making a film set today, you wouldn't point out how a car works. You would just have the character in the car and again focusing on what they're doing, what they're feeling.
Yeah, there's a very sort of soft focus on emotions here, but there's a lot of back and forth between the main couple, like Colin Farrell and Jodie Turner-Smith. Their sort of gentle marital strife. There's clearly some strain over the fact that Colin Farrell is taking the death of Yang a lot worse than she is, at least at first. And yeah, there's definitely some sort of marital strain there, but again, it never gets to the melodrama. It never gets to let's shout at each other and cry. It just kind of is.
Yeah.
A sort of gentle back and forth tug.
And also it shows the kind of how very emotional things like the death of a family member put pressure on relationships. But yeah, done in a subtle way. Yeah, partly because the performances are very, very good. I think the whole cast is great. Again, we said in a recent episode, Colin Farrell having a very strong year between... this is a very subtle, understated performance. He did a subtle, understated sort of internal performance in a different way for 13 Lives, but also he's done The Batman this year. So he's been all over the shop, but he's been doing great work.
Yeah, no, good year for Colin Farrell. This is probably his best performance in terms of sheer subtlety and emotion. Although obviously I enjoyed the Batman film to a point.
Yeah, the rest of the cast, very strong. Again, Jodie Turner-Smith, great performance. Really getting insight into how she's thinking and how she's processing the kind of the grief of the loss. They're a really natural couple together, I think, Jake and and Kara, you really get a sense just in the sort of scenes them between themselves of like, it seems like a marriage and like people who've been together for a long time and are very familiar with each other and sort of, I guess aware of their relationship. It's very believable.
Well, yeah, they have, yeah. That's, as I say, that sort of back and forth is kind of there, and it seems very natural between them. And, the child actor playing their daughter's good as well, which is important because obviously the way she feels about her brother dying is pretty pivotal.
Yeah, and then you also kind of get her emotions reflected in the other characters. A lot of, again, the parents, they're, as well as trying to grieve themselves, they're also trying to put their daughter's emotional needs first, which is what parents do. And you really get a sense of them that, like, they're really trying to help her through this very difficult time in her life and help her deal with the fact that the revelation of like sad things do happen and they can't always be fixed and you have to learn to move on and live with them, but also not forget things that are important to you. And it's none of it's stated and none of it's like brought out in like obvious like heavy-handed dialogue that this is what they're trying to do, but yeah, you just get the family dynamic and the way the family works just through this sort of few quiet moments of them kind of sitting up at night together just sharing a glass of water in like one scene. It's subtle, it's quiet, but it conveys a lot, in sort of what's going on beneath the surface.
Yeah, as you say, it's quite low key, in perhaps unfairly. That means it may not stay with me as much as, films that include more loud explosions or emotional catharsis, but I can't deny it's very artfully done. Yeah,
it's nice to see science fiction breaking out into new areas, or certainly like science fiction cinema. I mean, in some ways, this film is treading on thematic ground we're all very familiar with. It's sort of are AIs people? And as the Colin Farrell character explores his memories, there are twists and stuff there that, it's not a twist-heavy film like, Inside Man, but it's worth not knowing where it does go because, it's not pure mood. There is like a plot that unfolds and it's worth kind of coming to that without preconceptions. But as it goes through that, it is exploring this whole thing like, are androids people? Do they have the same emotions as people? Which is familiar ground for science fiction, but this is doing it certainly for a sci-fi film, in a new, or at least what seems tonally fresh and subtler way, which is really nice to see sci-fi cinema evolving in this way.
Yeah, well, the relationship a lot of the people have to the techno-sapiens, I think they call them, the androids.
Yeah.
And it's quite sort of uncertain, especially when they go and talk to a couple of like experts. It's like, well, we don't really quite know how these things work or how exactly they think or exactly what's inside. And it's all quite sort of mysterious, and I don't know, you almost get a bit sort of how did these things that no one understands end up being unleashed among the population? Is that what it would actually be like if robots really were deployed into the world? I don't really know.
Yeah, in a sci-fi novel you might dig more into that. So that may see, were these machines made by other machines that are so vast and complex that people don't really understand them? I mean, that's a sort of interesting world-building point, but the film is really not trying to do that. But it is a nice, again, world-building moment that, yeah, that there's machines in the world and we don't know how they work. But then again, we don't know how the human brain works, really.
Well, yeah, I think, yeah, maybe that's the point they're making, really. They're just people, but robots, and we don't really understand either. Yeah, it's nicely done. Again, it's not, I'm pretty certain they didn't do that because they're angling for a sequel. It's just a nice sort of additional level of depth.
Yeah, and the sort of subtlety of the world building. The other sort of subtle thing of the world building is that there's definitely something about how in this world, Western people are adopting Chinese children, because the idea of having Yang as an older sibling for their adopted Chinese daughter. Yeah, that this is common enough that it's commented on as not an unusual thing. The world's common enough that people have, techno-sapien members of their families, but there seems to be like, a specific niche of people wanting older siblings for Chinese adopted children to keep them connected with their Chinese heritage whilst they grow up in a Western society. And it's never really explained why this is the case, but obviously you get in the history of this world, something's happened that has made this a sort of thing that is commonplace enough that people don't really remark on it. And the Colin Farrell character mentions this, there's a lot of sort of like knowing kind of, oh yeah, from the other characters, which is a thing that's never really explored, but you get a sense of the deeper world behind this film from these small moments.
Yeah, no, it's good, as I say. That's the sort of subtle world building that puts it slightly above the average episode of Black Mirror.
Yeah.
Some of Black Mirror is quite good. I'm not using it entirely as a curse word. But yeah, they're doing something tangibly different here.
Yeah, I think it's tonally different and things like that, which is why, again, it's a slightly more optimistic vision of the future, a future where technology can help us enrich our lives. And, maybe, again, what it's saying is that, this is a social problem. There's a lot of Chinese children that need to be adopted, but people feel they don't want these Chinese children to lose touch with their cultural heritage, even though there aren't many Western parents who understand Chinese culture enough to raise a child that's in touch with their own heritage. And technology has found a solution to this. So it's almost an optimism to say that, yeah, tech's there to make life easier. It's there to reduce suffering and broaden our minds, as well as do all the dark stuff like turn us against each other and make us perpetually angry and violent. So, yeah, it's just maybe slightly Black Mirror, but slightly more optimistic.
But also sad. Okay, and that was Moderate Fantasy Violence. Thank you for listening as ever. If you want still more in a similar vein, you can go to moderatefantasyviolence.com to find our previous episodes, deleted scenes, articles, and so on. And if you love it, you can then go to your podcast app of choice and leave us a nice 5-star review. Thank you very much.
You can also find more from us on Twitter, where we're at MFV Podcast, or follow us on Facebook by searching for Moderate Fantasy Violence. You can find more from me on Twitter, where I'm at Alistair J.R. Ball, and you can find more of my writing at redtrainblog.com.
And you can find more from me at NickMB on Twitter and nickbryan.com on Instagram. And if you're coming to the London MCM convention in late October or Thought Bubble in Harrogate in November, I will be in both of those places selling my comics. Come and get them. And yes, next episode of Modern Fantasy Violence, we'll be covering all the latest Marvel TV with both She-Hulk and Werewolf by Night for our very thematically appropriate Halloween special. Plus, in yet more big telly, we'll be covering The Rings of Power. See you then. Bye-bye.
Bye. Time to get inside the man.
I did assume that will come up at some point, yes.
Just gonna Lance that boil now.